everyone. My name is Stacy Beamer. I'm the Coordinator of Digital Learning and Media Services here at Grantwood AEA, and we are excited to share. Our digital learning team has put together some resources to help support districts to develop some online learning, and we're going to go through that resource with you today. We do have a lot of people, now we're at 55 or so on this Zoom with us, so just some norms that I'd like to go through is if you could keep yourself muted, that would be great. But also if you are able to keep your camera on, that will help us as a team just kind of monitor reactions and see if there's people that have questions, and just building community. I think this is a good thing too. It's hard to build relationships and community when people are in a virtual environment, so keeping your camera on will help us do that. If you do have questions as we get going, please feel free to add them to the chat. We'll be putting some resources and links also in the chat. Yep. Okay, I'm just making sure that I can see the chat. So throw those in there. We'll stop periodically and go through that. Also, if you want to, there's the participant icons at the bottom of Zoom. And if you click on those participant icons, feel free at any point in time to use those participant icons to have me speed up or have us slow down, or if you like something, there is that applause and that thumbs up. So if there's something that you see that you like, let us know, give us that feedback as well. Oh, we're up to 61 people, so good deal. Okay, and we understand that people are at home right now, so if you can't have your camera on, that is fine. If you are able to, that would be wonderful. Okay, and the link to the slide deck is in the chat. We'll add it again later too. So let's get started. So the outcomes for the session today is just to build your awareness of the supports for online learning, professional development we have put together to help support teachers. And we're also going to provide an administrative resource for some considerations, because in order, as we know, to support teachers, there's some foundational things that school leaders need to have to set us up for success. And then we're going to provide you an overview and some potential applications of our continuous learning field guide. And again, these resources and application for the field guide we will share with you in an email, follow-up email, and a recording of a deeper dive session with some more details on use that we're going to just touch on today. Okay. So in order to know where we need to go, we need to know where we're at. So I would just love to poll you all to find out, and a poll will pop up here momentarily, thinking about where you are in the process of creating your return to learn plan in regards to online learning. So where are you at, or another way to frame this is, where are you at in supporting your teachers in regards to online learning? So you haven't yet begun, you're discussing options. A plan is being developed, fine-tuning or refining a plan. A plan is ready for implementation, or you know what, I just don't know, because I'm not a part of that. So Lynn, are you opening up?
Yep. All right, so on your screen in just a second, you will see the poll. And so if you would go ahead and reply. I love that you were all over it and you were already answering in the chat, which is awesome. But if you would take a second to reply on the poll. And for those of you who are teachers who are joining us, kind of letting us know what you know about the process.
Lynn, can you see the poll results?
I can. Right now, it's looking like a majority of people are kind of still in the planning phase, where they're discussing options and they're developing a plan. Kind of those two seem to be the highest percentages. Most are leaning towards the plan being developed, with about 36% of our participants are kind of in that range.
Okay. I just want to make sure you guys could see it on your screens because I know it. So this will help us as we frame that conversation today and the sharing to hopefully give you some things to use within your development of the plan. And if you're tuning and refining your plan too, if there's any supports you need, hopefully you can pull from this too. Okay. We're going to move on. So this continuous learning field guide, has anyone taken a look at that? Has anyone taken a look at the site yet? If you could, give me a thumbs up on your screen. Okay, or if you can use the participant icons too, there's a little thumbs up or applause. Beth did a nice job. She just put it in the chat. There's a bit.ly in the chat as well on the slide deck. Great. Okay, so if you haven't, you're gonna get your first exposure to this continuous learning field guide today. This guide we developed to build on what we did earlier this spring. This spring we kind of went into, I don't know about you, but kind of an emergency online learning teaching mode to provide kids what we could do within voluntary or required learning, whatever your district or building chose to do. And I'm gonna say teachers are amazing people and they did the very best they can for with the tools that they had access to and the knowledge that they already had. So now that's kind of the sprint, what we did this spring. We went at it, we went all out. And now this is really helping us to design for the marathon. So what does good instruction look like? Now that we've got a little more time to catch our breath and apply some best practices to teaching and learning, what could continuous learning look like? And what's nice is I don't think any of this is really new. But it's just applying it in an online environment that's also good. I was an elementary teacher and I like the face-to-face a whole lot better than I like the online. But a lot of these things I can learn about and apply in an online environment are really good for me in a face-to-face environment too when we get back to that on a regular basis. So our continuous learning guide is really designed to be self-paced for folks to go through, and we talk about different domains. We'll talk about the introduction page here in a minute, but we talk about designing online instruction, what does it look like to deliver it, and part of the delivery involves enhancing communication and collaboration, so there's a module about that, and then planning feedback and formative assessment. We also have some additional supports here to get us started thinking about the introduction and developing a common vocabulary. Maggie's going to talk about that here because that's essential to have before you get started in your design. There's a module for problem solving for learner success, which we'll talk about, which meets different learner needs. One of the things we know is there's kids, and you guys have teachers. How many of you have experienced kids that thrive in a face-to-face, but when it comes to online learning, they're not as engaged? So what are some things we can do to try to be proactive in that regard? And then also, again, administrative supports. We have a page on that. Throughout the website and the learning, you will have use these documents. There is a glossary of terms, a checklist with key components as you are working through each domain. There's also a reflection log that will help track application and your learning. So we've designed this to be used as a learning tool, so it could be in a learning team environment. So this could be your kind of workbook to work through and help apply. And then also a continuous learning field guide toolbox. So that has a list of tools and resources on how to use the tools within the context in appropriate ways. So these are going to be referenced throughout the site. Again, application ideas, using it for teachers independently or collaboratively with teacher teams, and then leadership teams or instructional coaches can pull content and share it with colleagues as learning opportunities. Again, we have another session going on right now that's taking this a little bit more in depth, and I will be sharing that recording with everyone. And always feel free to reach out to one of your digital learning consultants to help walk you through some of those ideas too. This is Grant Wood. Gina Rogers, if anybody knows Gina, thinks he looks like Ed Sheeran. It is really Grant Wood's Bitmoji, is what we were going for here. But he's going to pop up throughout, giving some tips and call out of things we can do. So that's the home page. Now where the meat and potatoes start, I just stole somebody else's line there, is really within the introduction. So I'm going to hand it over to Maggie to talk about this foundation.
Hey there, my name is Maggie Pickett. I'm a digital learning consultant at Grantwood AEA. Thanks, Stacy, for letting me hop in here. So our introduction page, like Stacy said, this is where we're starting to get into the meat and potatoes. I might look at it more of a building. The introduction module is kind of the foundation. This is where everybody's getting a common understanding of a few different things. So the first video that we have, this would be just an introduction. It kind of walks you through this introduction module, if you will. And then the next component that we have is a glossary of terms. Now, Stacy mentioned that just a minute ago from the home page. This is going to be, these terms are going to be brought up in every module. We're going to highlight which terms we talk about. We talk about multiple, many of these sorry, Stacy. We talk about many of these in each of our modules. And so what we'll do is it's a hyperdoc. So you just click on that and it will take you to the term and give you a deeper understanding of that term. So as you go throughout the learning, you can hyperlink back to this just to get that common language that that Stacy mentioned is so critical. So the next component, again, the foundational common understanding that we all need to move forward is thinking about time recommendations. Now, the content that we've pulled here comes from the Illinois Department of Education, and it looks at time recommendations from pre-K all the way up to 12th grade. These are going to take you out to documents where it really kind of scopes out what the learning could or should look like if we're in an online setting. And so this will, again, you can kind of go grade by grade and kind of look at those and consider those as you're moving through this course and these modules to think about how learning and the time component. Another thing to think about, oh, there's Grant Wood again. All right. All of our modules have reflection questions, an opportunity for our educators to kind of think about their practice, think about the content they just learned, and really kind of start to get a handle on what they're thinking and feeling based on what they know and what they just learned. So the last component to this introductory module is the, sorry, Stacy, scroll back up there. Oh. So we're just wrapping this up, and this is going to introduce you to the next 4 domains. And then once we get done with that video, then down here at the bottom, we have our navigation buttons. This will take you on to the next module in the lineup. And I'm going to throw it over to Lynn, who's going to take it from there.
Hi, everybody. I'm Lynn Kleinmeyer, for those of you who don't know me. So designing online instruction, this is where we're really digging in to the content. You know, the previous page that Maggie just talked about, the home and the introduction pages are kind of laying the foundation, giving you some context. And so now we are starting to move into the actual learning and application of this online environment and instruction. So the first component or domain is designing online instruction. You can see that we've got this progression across the screen that kind of shows you where you are in this process. So with these next 4 pages, you're going to see a very similar structure and layout. And that was done very intentionally as you navigate your way through. So every single one of these domains begins with a domain introduction that gives you a little bit of context of what this particular domain is all about, and also highlights some of the learning objectives, as well as talks you through how you're going to navigate the page. So for example, with designing online instruction, it's really about establishing your home base, which is one of our vocabulary terms. It's that space where your students and your parents are going to connect with the content and with each other. And so you'll notice that underneath these introductions are these vocabulary pieces. So it links back to the slide deck that Maggie had highlighted before, but just making sure that we are all on the same page, that we have not only common language, but also this common understanding. And so as you go into this domain and you think about learning about your home base, there's kind of 2 different components. So we're breaking this down for you in the Learn It section, which is something that you're going to see reflected in all of these pages. the first component of establishing the home base is thinking about your asynchronous learning platforms. So those are the platforms that your parents or your students are going to be going to engage with content or with each other when you're not in a quote unquote face-to-face environment. So one of the things that we recognized when we were putting this together is that lots of our districts actually have already established some sort of learning management system that they're already using. And so as you think about this component, really encouraging you to think about what is your district already using. And so we highlighted some of the major ones that we know our districts are currently utilizing. One of the pieces, though, that we recognized is even though your district may already be using one of these landing spaces, this home base, there's always an opportunity to build your own capacity and help you to learn a little bit more. So we structured this next piece to kind of help not only if you are already using these, but also to structure your own learning if these are unfamiliar to you. So with each of these buttons that you see, it will actually link you out to our continuous learning field guide toolkit. So basically this is a resource where we are highlighting every single platform, every single tool that we are referencing in the continuous learning field guide and providing you with some structures and some places to learn a little bit more. So with all of these, we've tried to really be intentional about scaffolding and supporting you to learn a little bit more. So when you've identified and explored what your options are and picked one, we've also kind of built in some opportunities for you to think about best practices. What are your best practices when it comes to utilizing an asynchronous learning platform? So you'll notice we've got a video and then some key highlights for you that are really intentionally pulling out some of those think abouts, those things that you need to be mindful of when transitioning to this learning platform. And then once again, here's the bonus tip from Grant Wood. So you'll see that these are highlighted throughout our pages, those extra little bonus material kinds of pieces, followed by reflection questions. These are meant to help you throughout this process to be very intentional about what are things that you maybe need to consider as you're going through and you're learning, building your own capacity, and also applying. So you'll notice that these are reflected all the way through. And then you'll see this lovely little icon that Maggie is going to talk about a little bit more specifically. Stacy referenced it already, I believe, where we recognize that sometimes making this transition to an online learning platform, there might be some things that students encounter or you encounter as an instructor that you want to address in order to help your learners meet success. So Maggie's gone through and kind of highlighted some of those things that we've heard from people, maybe are things that they want to do to support or scaffold their learners. So that will lead you out there. And then as we progress our way down the page, not only do we think about the asynchronous, we also think about the synchronous. What are those moments for us to make connections with our students face to face? And I did air quotes as though you can all see me right now, but with that, going into two of our options for that, Google Meet or Zoom, as well as, once again, some best practices, some think about, some considerations for you as you begin to structure these learning environments for your students. And so once again, you're going to see a Grant Wood tip, a reflection. You'll notice this pattern kind of continues, very predictable, intentionally to help support you. And then, as we've mentioned, the difference with this particular learning field guide is that it is meant to help you actually apply your learning. And so it's our intent that as you progress your way through this entire site, that you actually walk away with some materials. So at the bottom of this apply it page, we're actually asking you to apply everything that you've learned by building your home base. And so we've created some templates for you to help, once again, structure and scaffold you as you go through this entire process. And what's really nice about this particular template is that then it feeds right into the other component of the apply, which is actually setting up some communication for your family. So it kind of feeds nicely into it. So as you progress your way through, it's our intent not only to support and scaffold and help you build your capacity, but also to allow you to some time to apply your learning and walk away with something at the end. So as we wrap up the designing online instruction, once again, the field guide log that we referenced earlier, this is a place for you to collect everything that you've been doing, your think abouts, your things that you're creating. And then it's time to actually think about how are you going to deliver the online instruction. So I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to my colleague, Beth, who's going to talk a little bit about this component.
Hi, I'm Beth Swans, and I'm happy to talk with you about this. One other thing I want to mention is if you have questions or things come up through this process, feel free to add those to the chat, and we will address those as we go along. So just a little reminder there. So we've got a home base set. The next step is really what are we going to do in this online environment? And I think the lens to look through this with is what has already been occurring in your districts and how do you want to take that to a different place. So for some districts, that means going from voluntary to more of it's an expectation that the learning will happen online for students. So that may be a different kind of a lens to look through. This specific module, our key components are really thinking about how are we going to focus on learning objects, how are we going to scaffold and model in an online environment, how are we going to use reflection and best practices as we think about our content, and then how do we really engage students in ways that promote voice and choice. So we start out with a little video that goes over all of that, and then we start digging into each of those specific areas in a little bit deeper. The Learn It section really has some deeper thoughts in those areas. So starting first of all with a learning object. Making sure that you were starting with a learning object, we're focusing in on that. There's a video that kind of walks you through that process. And then if we can, and one thing I may mention is we have a transcript for all of our videos. If you'd rather read it instead of listen, you can do that. Following the video, there are some exemplars or some examples of lessons that we feel like highlight this very strongly in lesson planning. The next kind of the key component is scaffolding. So how do you create scaffolds that include models in an online environment? There's a lot of different things to think about, some look-fors there, which are included. This entire domain, we're building a checklist in each of these four different areas that we'll use at the end. So this list here of our kind of look-fors for scaffolding: chunking things, checking for understanding, providing learning in different modalities. Those are all ways to really make sure that you're providing models and scaffolding for a wide variety of students. Grant keeps popping up to give us some tips. He's a little thoughtful in this one. We also have some links to some tools here, Seesaw and Google Docs, that provide examples, additional examples for what the scaffolding can look like. Then we want to think about specifically about best practices in teaching and learning in relationship to the content. So this is where we start thinking about how do we deliver content in an online way that is different than in a face-to-face way, and some tips and some things to think about and some look-fors as you're creating your lessons. Again, we have some examples here of some tools that we feel like are really helpful in this area, and an exemplar lesson specific to science using phenomena to kind of focus in on that best practices. The last one is about voice and choice and how do we really engage learners. One of the things that I have heard from classroom teachers is this is the most difficult part right now. How do we keep students engaged? So this is really addressing some different ways, different ideas of how you might build engagement. Again, we have some examples here. These are choice board, hyperdoc examples, some online options that might engage students in a different way by chunking the materials in a different way, by providing different modalities. These choice board examples like tic-tac-toe and things like that. then we get down into what is the apply it. So what are we going to do with this information? The delivery of online instruction, we've created a checklist that compiles all of the components that we talked about so far. And the apply it example here is to take that checklist and then look at an elementary or a middle school or a high school lesson and use that online checklist to kind of evaluate that lesson. How did that teacher do in using all these things? Knowing that we can't do everything at once, so this is a learning process, but how could this look? So kind of familiarizing yourself with the checklist, using it on someone else's work. And then ultimately, it is to use that checklist to really apply to your own lesson planning. So using a previously delivered lesson or using a lesson, an asynchronous or synchronous, and applying these different look fors. So at the bottom, then we have the checklist linked down here, and it's really thinking this whole domain has really been addressing what does online instruction look like? How is it different than face-to-face instruction? What are the things that we know from practice that are helpful in planning that way? So once we have that sort of put together, there's more to it than just delivering instruction. And a lot of that has to do with communication and collaboration. And Stacy is going to kind of address some of that.
You're muted, my friend.
Thanks for the cue. I'm trying to multitask here because I'm putting stuff in the chat too. So any good instruction, learning is social, right? So we need to make sure whether we're face-to-face, asynchronous or synchronous, we are enhancing communication and collaboration for students and for adults too. So this is what the focus is of our third domain. Again, there's a list of look fors and an overview video that will explain what this page is about. And it's going to give you a little bit more in-depth description than what I'm going to go through in the high-level overview right now. But we really need to think about, as we go through with online learning, what tools, just like if I'm in my classroom and I'm going to facilitate some collaboration, I need to have tools. Online, you need to do the same thing. So what are your outcomes and learning objectives, and then what tools will help you reach that goal? Again, highlighted vocabulary. One of the things that I do want to mention is that we can collaborate online and offline too. So there can be some asynchronous components too, but when you're designing and delivering online instruction, there needs to be some offline activities too, considering not everyone is going to have equity of access in an online world. So just thinking about that, we do need to design some offline instruction activities too. So that's part of this. So the first part of enhancing communication and collaboration really looks at selecting and using your instructional strategies. We need to establish norms. As a fourth grade teacher, I had rules, and as a middle school teacher, I had a few different rules. Many were the same though. In my classroom, those were our norms. Well, just like at the meeting today, this is a sit and get direct instruction kind of model, which isn't great. So I apologize, as y'all have been on a lot of Zooms or Google Meets recently, but we established some norms, and you can have your kids work with you to establish those norms. And the same is true. We need to teach them how to communicate and collaborate online, assigning roles for students, providing response stems. So we need to explicitly teach how do we communicate online, what is the protocol we're going to use, how are we going to communicate with our peers, what are some stems that we can use. And again, I think about when I was in the classroom face-to-face, I did the same thing. We had feedback stems to help guide kids on giving appropriate responses and communicating with the intent that they wanted. So thinking about those things. So we've got some learning here about developing culturally responsive norms in remote learning and situations, okay? And then also the stems. So great learning opportunities here, thinking about assigning what kind of roles I know, like I said, many of us did this in our classroom. And down here, again, we have provided some samples for people to pull from, at least to get started. Reflection questions, just to think about if learners are struggling a little bit, how do we make sure you're successful in breakout rooms and all kids are successful? Okay. Again, selecting your digital tool, but we've got to consider the delivery. Is it synchronous or asynchronous online tool? There's some great tools that we talk about that are for synchronous. Identifying the type of communication, if they're going to communicate or collaborate, defining that for kids, getting them to have some experience with those tools before we use them, practicing with them, modeling it back to that I do, we do, you do kind of thing, so they have appropriate support. Also thinking about too, how you're communicating with parents so that they know that there's some supports provided. If we're going to use a tool, let's say like Google Classroom, or we're using Seesaw, it's also nice to kind of front load, and this is mentioned too, front loading your parents with some resources to help get them going. Here are a list of synchronous tools that we can use for communication and collaboration, and as well as some asynchronous tools. So I look at these, and many of our classrooms were using, minus Zoom breakout rooms and whiteboard features, but a lot of these features and these synchronous and asynchronous tools our teachers were already using when we were in a brick and mortar classroom. So it could be used easily when we're back in normal teaching and learning situation, brick and mortar, but it can be used in a hybrid or totally online approach too. Tip from Grant Wood, let's consider cognitive load. That's really important. I don't know how many of you have reached the end of your cognitive load at the end of the day, but we got to think about kids too as we're getting information and more thrown at us. So that's really important to think about the what we're asking of kids. Okay, one of the other things that we wanted to make sure we called out is communicating and collaborating with colleagues is equally as important. Providing some tools to help support that, especially as we have teams of teachers working in virtual PLCs, or you are supporting a student on an IEP, or you're supporting a struggling learner. How are you going to communicate and collaborate in an efficient way, an effective way with colleagues? So we've added some resources here and some synchronous and asynchronous tools. And these are just some that we call out. This is not an all exhaustive list by any means with any of these tools that we've talked about. Reflection question again, that comes up again in our log. That's kind of the workbook. Now, another opportunity we want to make sure is that there is some regular communication, and I alluded to this earlier, as we provide feedback or provide communication to students and families about opportunities for feedback. And I'm talking about more feedback on the tools that we're using, or the amount of the cognitive load, how much work, what are the expectations, those kind of things. Are there opportunities for feedback around that? And what are those methods? Is it an email that you're sending out, or is it a Google form that they complete? Reflection questions, again, thinking about another consideration for learner success. And then the last element is that apply it. So after people go through this module or this domain, to think about how are we going to design an opportunity for students or colleagues to collaborate. So there's 3 or 4 options here for the application. Again, the look fors, that's kind of our checklist. And then the field guide log has all of that rolled into it. So we've delivered some instruction, we've asked students to communicate with each other and with me as a teacher and collaborate, and now it's time for feedback and formative assessment. So I'm going to pass the baton back to Beth.
So this is one of the areas that I feel like the online environment can really be leveraged in some pretty powerful ways to plan some feedback and formative assessment. And as Stacy and everybody has mentioned, we see teachers doing this in their classrooms all the time, but this online environment can really, I think we can really capitalize on this possibility. So there are a couple different key points in this one as well. And the first one, as all of them, we're going to start with an introduction. We're going to look specifically at some vocabulary, asynchronous and synchronous learning. And then we're going to really look at how does feedback move the learning forward. This takes into account what kind of feedback are we talking about? Feedback that is goal-oriented, is positive for the students, focused on the work, and is very specific, and is always moving the learning to a new place. Now, instead of us talking about this, we have an expert that you can hear speak to this. Dr. John Hattie was interviewed by 2 of our digital learning consultants this past year. Mindy Carney and Gina Rogers interviewed him for the EdTech Takeout. And this is a link to the whole podcast that Dr. John Hattie is talking about visible learning and all sorts of different things. But specifically, he talks about 4 types of feedback. And what does he mean when he talks about feedback that moves the learning forward? So on the task, it says like where in the time you would queue up to hear just that part of it. But I would recommend listening to the entire podcast. He is an expert of talking about what he sees in classrooms and what they know work. And so he really applies feedback through that lens. The next kind of area of feedback is making sure that it occurs in multiple formats and from multiple voices. So there's a link to an article here that's specific for online learning and strategies that teachers might want to use in this online learning environment that can really make sure that students are hearing feedback in different ways and different formats. Then we can't talk about feedback without talking about about formative assessment. So formative assessment tools, teachers I believe they have a toolkit of formative assessment tools. This is not necessarily saying, here's a new tool and here's how to use it. Instead, it's really looking at formative assessment tools and figuring out what the goal of that tool is. Many times the goal of a formative assessment tool is to give information to the teacher, but in this online learning environment, we also need to get that feedback to the student so that they can take some responsibility for their learning path. And that feedback needs to be adjusted based on, the learning path needs to be adjusted based on that feedback. So there's a really great, very short video and an article that are specific of using feedback using formative assessment in different ways. I'm mixing my words. Using formative assessment in different ways. The apply it activity then is to think about formative assessments that teachers are already using and what are the best assessments to use in an asynchronous environment and a synchronous environment. This links out to the toolkit that we talked about before. Most of these teachers will have heard of. GimKit might be one that people haven't heard of. They could explore a little bit. But this kind of gives you an idea of some different formative assessment tools and really taking it a step farther to how are you going to use that information in your classroom. I also included some dig deeper on this one. These are additional articles and additional bits of information about feedback and formative assessment that I felt like were really helpful to continue to deepen our understanding of using those in this online environment. So we end up with the look fors, what are our big ticket items, and then the next area kind of that we address this in a lot of different ways, but what happens with students that are not engaged in this process? How do we problem solve? How do we think about different ways of providing supports? And I'm going to hand it over to Maggie, and she can kind of lead us through that section.
Thanks, Beth.
So the problem solving for learner supports module is actually a supplemental module. This is good learning for any educator, but really it's crucial for instructional coaches, PLC coaches, teacher leaders, ELL teachers, special education teachers, and administrators. So the transition to online learning has really created new opportunities for students, but we've also seen that it's also created some new barriers for learners. And so with those new barriers, it's really become evident that teachers, and not just our special education or ELL teachers, all educators need a process to really consider what is the barrier and what are we going to do about it. And so that's what this module is all about. It's really focused at the individual student level, identifying and then removing those barriers. So there are three main objectives to this particular module. The first would be to identify and understand the guiding principles that are outlined there on the website. The second would be that educators will gain an understanding of a 4-part problem-solving process to, again, help identify and remove barriers to learning. And then finally, the third objective would be that the educators would be able to walk away with a toolkit that would provide them opportunity to explore options to remove or reduce barriers in the areas of academics, social, emotional, behavior, health, executive function, physical, sensory supports, communication language supports, technology supports, and then we did add a section on family and caregiver supports. So those are the main objectives. The introduction video will provide kind of a little more in-depth introduction. It'll also provide some information as to where kind of this process has come from, and just get to the point. It comes from the Iowa Department of Education. We have revamped it a little bit with permission to support kind of this new context that we're all living in. So then from there, after the introduction video, we will then step into that 4-part problem solving process. So step 1, yep. Oh, and let me address the highlighted vocabulary. So we are really talking about synchronous versus asynchronous, and then learner variability. We know that students are coming to these learning contexts with various different backgrounds and needs, and so we're really addressing learner variability within this entire module. But anyway, the 4-step problem solving process is: number 1, identify the barrier; number 2, understand the barrier; number 3, choose a support; and then number 4, understand or know if that tool or support is working. And so under each one of these videos, we'll provide you with some, under identify the barrier, we're going to give you a little document, a guide to walk through that process. So you can make a copy of that. And as you have students come up that need addressed, it'll actually have you make a copy, and then you can just work through it and document right there on the document. We also give you a cheat sheet that you can print off so you can have it with you all the time. Yep, perfect. Thanks, Stacy. And Grant, as always, joins us and provides some tips. And understanding the barrier, this is really about kind of getting to know what area the barrier is arising in. And this is where it's really important to have conversations with our learners. And so these different resources will provide you with different ways that we can survey or poll or have just one-on-one discussions with students about what they're thinking, feeling about their learning opportunities. So then when we choose a support, that's where that big toolkit comes in. And as you can see, after the video, it will introduce kind of the concept of this toolkit. And this is coming soon. We are still working on this and getting it ready to roll, but there are some additional resources that are already there and available. And then the final step is really needing to know if that tool is being supportive of the learner to help reduce the barrier. And so we've got some ideas there as well that reference some resources that we've already looked at in the previous steps. So once we get to the end of that 4-part problem solving process, we are asked to apply it. We're asked to think about a student. And I know just from having conversations with teachers, we've got somebody from the spring or from previous years' experiences that we can kind of walk through this process and try to really kind of get some some experience with thinking about students in this way. And so after we apply it, then we will kind of be able to, there are a couple of examples. Those are a couple of examples. I'm going to be filling that with more and more students to provide some additional examples. And then there's the toolbox again. And at the very bottom, so I did want to reference, this will take you back to the learning sequence. So there was a green icon, a circle icon throughout the website that kind of will tip educators into, hey, did you have a student like this? And it'll swing them back over into this module to pause the module where they were. They can do this module, and then this will take them right back to the rest of their learning. So that is the problem solving for learner success module. The next thing that we wanted to highlight for you, and it does not navigate from here, but it is a page on the website and that left side navigation bar. And Lynn is going to talk about our administrator supports page.
Excellent. Thanks, Maggie. As I look at the faces joining us today, a large majority of you are classroom teachers, educators. And so I love that we have provided this entire learning field guide specifically for you. But I also see that we have some administrators, some instructional coaches, some people at the district administration. And so just wanting to highlight that we recognize that this resource really is meant to scaffold and support teachers, but we also know that part of that scaffolding and support actually has to come from the administration level too. So we've developed this specific page for administrators. So those of you who are my instructional coaches, my administrators, this page is just for you. So it is set up very similar to what you've seen previously throughout the entire continuous learning field guide. But this page is meant to provide those scaffolds and supports for administrators and instructional coaches as they create and implement their return to learn plan. So it starts off with a brief introduction, navigation, explanation kind of component, just like you've seen before in that introduction. And then the next piece, this exploring the connections section. What we have done is made explicit connections between this continuous learning field guide, the continuous improvement model that's being used across the state, and the Department of Education's Return to Learn plan, in order for you to be able to see how this guide, that continuous improvement model, and the DE's Return to Learn plan all intersect and work together. So each of these is a drop-down menu that makes those explicit connections, but also provides some additional resources specific to administrators and instructional coaches to help scaffold and support as you scaffold and support your teachers. So kind of as you explore those connections, then there is a reflection section just for you, where we've tried to put in some of those explicit considerations for you to think about the structures you need to put in place or that you want to consider putting in place in order to support and ensure success for your students, for your staff, for your families. And so this entire reflection section is meant to really start to scaffold and engage you in some conversation and allow you the space to explore some of those considerations. Is it an exhaustive list? No, but it's a great place for you to start and to think through some of those planning pieces. A lot of you in that very beginning poll told us that you were in the process of considering your options and you were starting to come up with a plan. So this might be explicitly important for you right now to think about all of those considerations and have you, are there pieces that you might need to go back and discuss? So then the final section of this particular administration page is this dig deeper section, where we've provided you some links to things that are models, exemplars, considerations, and other resources that are referenced both in the Return to Learn plans, but all are tools that are meant to help and support you as you are crafting these plans. So exemplars from other states, exemplars of other resources that are mentioned. And if you look at the very, very bottom, as always, for any of this, whether you're an educator or an administrator,
we really encourage you to reach out to your digital learning consultant for some support or for additional questions and things like that. We are here to help, and we are here to support you. So with that, feel free to reach out. Now, we know that we've shared a lot of information with you. And this is meant to be like this overarching highlight of here's exactly what this is all about. Obviously, the next step is to kind of dig in and to take a look. And so we're curious. I'm going to, in just a moment, launch another poll. As you think about your experiences this spring, we're curious to know which domain or supplemental area would be an opportunity for you to grow. Where are you thinking you might start? So give me just a second, and I'm going to launch a poll for you, and we would love for you to respond, please. Okay, so as the results are coming in, there's a lot of people who are really interested in exploring the problem solving for learner success page, the enhancing communication and collaboration. Thank you. This is very helpful.
A glow from this spring, right, Lynn? So
Yeah.
what's gone well this spring that you can just keep building on?
Yeah.
Many of the conversations I think we've had, and this is the second time we've offered this webinar, I think the teacher collaboration has been really called out, and getting to know communication with families. I think that I've heard that over and over again, that we've reached out to more families and we've helped strengthen those relationships. So that's great, because that's really essential, and always we can get better.
And, you know, Stacey, I think everything that you just said, as I watched the results of this poll kind of come in, it seems to be reflected that enhancing communication and collaboration seems to be one that is of particular interest, as is the problem solving for learner success. So we've had most of our participants have responded. So I'm going to go ahead and end this poll and capture this real quick, because I think we have one other question. Correct, Stacey?
Yep. Oh, so that was my cue to go to the next slide.
See what we did there?
Okay, so we're gonna launch poll 3, which is gonna say poll 4, poll 3.
Yes. Give me just a moment.
I'm gonna, while you're pulling it up, Lynn, I'm just gonna address a question that came up in the chat, which is a great question. So we're going to talk about this here in a second. Somebody wanted to know about time frame and when would we recommend teachers going through this module. Could they go through it this summer? Will they be compensated for their time? So the compensation, we can't do anything with that, but we can support folks in using these learning modules. We would recommend, hey, once they take some time to regroup, and mental health, social, emotional elements too are built in throughout this plan, but also self-care for teachers too. So once they're ready to go through, we would say, hey, this would be a great thing to go through this summer. And our other webinar that I will send out to you guys talks about some options for credit for learning teams. And Lynn's going to talk about those in a minute too. So we'll get to that.
And
so you're going to talk about the grow?
Yes, as people are responding. So the next question, you know, the glow is, you know, what can we improve upon? But this next question is, from what you've experienced in the spring, you know, it's always a learning process, and you've heard that fail piece of first attempt in learning, and you know, those moments of where are those things that you recognize maybe as an individual or as a system are opportunities for you to dig in and to continue to improve. So where are those areas that you would like to grow? And it's interesting, I'm seeing from the results right now, a majority, about 29% of our respondents are choosing either planning for feedback and formative assessment or the problem solving for learner success. So definitely noticed as we implemented whether voluntary or required that there were some glitches, some things that you recognize that you wanted to go back and address, and to make sure that in future opportunities there would be that success for students. So excellent.
So now thinking about those options that I briefly mentioned. So facilitation options for continuous learning field guide. So this is where the learning can take place in different ways. And Lynn, I'm going to let you talk about the 4 ways, really quickly just mention the 4 options. Do you have those handy?
Yes, sorry, I was multitasking and
I know.
closing that poll. Well, the 4 options, basically we recognize that we could have a couple different ways that people would actually want to engage with, apply, use, implement, either personally or as teams. And so we tried to kind of highlight the options for people. So option 1 would be teachers who want to just dive in for their own independent learning. And those teachers, maybe are self-directed, it's not being encouraged by the district per se or required by the district. And so thinking for them, by all means, at any point in time, we have designed this entire site to be a self-paced site where you have everything that you need to engage with and to apply content. But we do actually have another option that won't be launched yet. It's still coming, but in July there is going to be an option for a course for licensure renewal credit. Stay tuned for more information.
I'm going to jump in there with our 2 other options because there's different ways to get recertification and credit. And one of the ways, so you can go through this independently. Another option is going through it as a learning team. So if you have 4 to 10 educators that want to go through this module together, we are going to have a pacing guide. So you can go through these modules together and complete that log sheet as your final product, and spend some time synchronously or asynchronously going through those discussion questions. And we'll have that all spelled out for you. So then you can pace yourselves and get a recertification credit. It's similar to like a book study model, but instead of a book, you're going through the continuous learning field guide. So that's 4 to 10 educators that can team up to do that. And that'll be really good because it'll be good conversation and within a district or building context. So that's another option that you could start. I'm going to send the information. Beth put the information and the options in the chat too, but I'll send, if you're interested in that, in the follow-up email, there'll be a link where you can fill out the form and I'll send you some more information. Another option is to go through it without credit. And then if we did the course option, we are also going to put this into a course. And I know one of our districts already started to do that. They started to take this and chunk it and put it into their home base that they're having all their teachers use is Google Classroom. So they're putting it in Google Classroom and then they're going to offer it. I think they're going to go with the learning team approach, but we will develop like a Canvas course. So that will be totally asynchronous. That if a district or a building would like to offer, we can have a district leader be on as instructor, co-instructor with one of us, and we can offer it that way too. So there'll be a formal course that you can take that's asynchronous, or I don't know. I like talking to people synchronous or too. So I think the conversation within learning teams could be very beneficial, and that will be available to sign up and start getting that scheduled next week. So follow-up information will be coming.
Stacy, as I'm looking out at our audience today, I'm seeing a lot of Grant Wood staff. Would these learning options be the same for those Grant Wood staff that are with us today as well?
I think they would be, yes. Good question, Maggie. Or if a Grant Wood staff person wanted to jump on with one of their buildings or their districts, they absolutely could. That might be a richer context too. Good question. Okay. Again, follow-up email will have this, and it will have the recording. We had a whole webinar going on right now with this, and I'm a minute over, so I need to quickly. Yep.
Can I interrupt for just a second? The other piece, I know there were several of you who had questions about the other webinar that's going on currently. that recording will be available as well. And it goes into these options and discusses what this actually looks like and some of the requirements. So we definitely encourage you to go back and revisit that so that you have the full context.
So as we start, we really want to think about the continuous improvement process, and we've started to determine your current state and identifying strengths and barriers. One of the things I will be sending to folks too is, I don't have it queued up, a survey that went out, just a sample survey that has gone out to staff just to see what went well this spring or what they need supports in. So that's always good to survey staff too, to get the ideas of what tools and resources they're using as you create your plan. And then obviously we're going to be implementing some new things, and then we just need to assess impact, and then we keep moving. But I will share that in the follow-up email too, a sample survey. And as Lynn said, our digital learning team or your regional administrator, please feel free to contact us if you have questions and you need additional support.